This is the new TC Pride Podcast, Episode 61, Part 3 of a special 4-part feature on the They Them Project.
I've always felt like this. I've always been this way. But it's not something that was super common or even known for a huge part of my life. And the more I studied it, the more I delved into gender studies and sexuality and especially like feminism, I understood that it wasn't so black and white. Even understanding it as a spectrum, understanding how deep that spectrum went, helped me understand that, okay, I don't fit into this mold or this idea or anything related to the gender binary. I'm just who I am and have always felt this way, and this feels right. And I still question it sometimes and then immediately think, this feels right. This is who I am. And it just took a long time to get there because it's a lot of soul searching and understanding yourself to get to that point.
Hannah, use they, them pronouns.
So in the video that Brent did for the project, you had talked about how understanding gender as a spectrum was an important part of your experience.
Yeah, understanding that gender is a completely fabricated idea that has historically been used pretty much to control people and put them in little boxes when humans are not actually like that. Human life is a spectrum, gender is a spectrum. Everything is just relative to the person.
So you had said you prefer they, them pronouns, but you said that there are some times where you've accepted she, her pronouns.
Yeah, depending on who I'm with. I actually spend a lot of my time in like very queer spaces. So like my work is an incredibly queer space. I work for Claire Housing, which is a nonprofit. I'm sure that I know that Brent actually does stuff with Red Ribbon Ride and we host them. But so I'm always in this queer bubble all the time. But when I step outside of that, that's when it's hard to actually like talk to people about gender, especially when they can get like very aggressive with you about it. And, you know, that's like a traumatic experience and not necessarily something that like we all want to deal with. So sometimes, yeah, it's like definitely easier to just revert to like using one of the binary pronouns. And for me, that would be she, her, based on what I look like.
So there are a few terms that gender nonconforming, gender non-binary people are using to identify themselves right now. And as a big part of this project is educating people about what some of the appropriate terminology is, could you maybe talk about a few of them?
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say if somebody asks me about my gender identity, depending on like how well I understand their understanding of gender, I could use like a few different ways of explaining it. So someone who really doesn't know anything about gender, I'll say gender non-binary, which literally means that like I don't identify with either male or female. But when you step beyond that and you go towards like gender queer, gender fluid, like those big umbrella terms that actually kind of are much more inclusive to the queer community, then that would definitely be more of like the direction that I prefer to go in, especially since in itself, a word being inclusive or a way of explaining something that encapsulates just queerness as far as like an identity and a whole community together. I think that's like a really cool way to explain that.
Brent had also asked you something about your name, because I think you had said in the video too about how people often perceive you as female, but you identify as with they, them pronouns. And he had asked you something about if you'd ever thought about changing your name.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back into the whole like binary thing, the whole construct of the gender binary. And so we have like gendering of like names, gendered clothing, gendered this, that, and pretty much everything else. I mean, we have like gender reveal parties for babies. It's super bizarre, but In reality, like all of these things are just names. And I'm speaking for me specifically. Other people will have very different ideas, obviously, but for me, I have a air quotes female name, but I had a partner who identified as male, but had a air quotes again, female name, and it's in reality like it just ties right back into that whole like illusion of gender and gendered everything.
So another question that Brent asked everybody was on the 1 to 10 scale, like how much do you think about your gender? And I can't remember what number you gave specifically, but you'd said something about how it does define you. It's something that really does define you, but it's something that maybe you don't think about much.
I don't think I did give a number, but as far as like it defining me or not defining me, it defines me in the way that it is who I am. It's just like part of what makes me me. But as far as like thinking about it or just being aware of it, I think about it probably every day. It's just like a normal thing for me is to like think about like gender identity or like any of those things, because it like really ties into just how I interact with the world around me. I'm very aware of how I'm being perceived or treated because I am perceived as female. So people treat me as female. So which means I can't walk around outside without constantly like watching my back to make sure that like I'm going to be safe. I don't have that luxury that like male-bodied people mostly do and things like that. But as far as like anything else, it just ties into who I am as a person. So it's kind of like a yes and no like reaction to like how important it is. I think the most important thing is to start asking questions if you don't understand it, if you're like freaked out by it, even like just the biggest enemy ever to just moving forward as a society, like as a species even, is just learning. Like we are so afraid of the things that we don't understand, and if you just stop and ask questions and keep an open mind, like it's really not that scary. And the whole idea is not that outlandish either. Like digging back into history of where gender comes from and all the different kinds of genders in different societies over the course of human history, it's actually not that crazy. Like we're not crazy people. Our gender identity isn't a mental illness that some people will claim it is. It's literally just people. It's no different from everyone else that you run into. We just like, we're queer. That's okay.
Well, thank you so much for being here and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Before I figured out that I was trans, I was overcompensating for that. And I had a lot of sort of misogyny related to like not wanting to associate with anything that I deemed feminine, because I thought that being feminine was worse than being masculine, because I didn't have my gender figured out. And so that like tension and that dislike of anything feminine in me was externalized. And so I didn't, for many years in my adolescence, I had a back and forth relationship with anything feminine, which I say feminine, but it's like anything that I or society had arbitrarily deemed to be feminine. And so I had this back and forth. And so a more genuine way of me expressing my gender is letting go of that and trying to shed that and be more comfortable in my body and be more aligned with my body and feel present and embodied in space in a way that allows me to move more naturally and not be constantly interrogating and saying like, no, I can't do that. I can't do that because people are going to misgender me and think I'm a girl if I do that, and I can't do that, and I can't do that, and I can't do that. And letting go of that is how I am currently trying to express my gender.
My name's Chandler Daly. I use they, them, their, and he, him, his pronouns.
So you said in your interview that early on in your journey, you were actually pushing away a lot of things that you felt were feminine, and until you got to the point of letting go of some of that. How important was that part of the journey to your overall journey up to this point? And since you said you also like have shared your experience with a lot of other like transgender nonconforming people, is that something that you found is kind of a common experience for people early on in their journeys?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think that's common, and I and my other like trans masculine or trans male friends laugh about that. How like very often, and I don't know if it was like, I don't know how you would characterize it in terms of like a journey, but like it's very common to when before you kind of figure out you're trans. At least for me, like when I was in high school and middle school, I like desperately wanted to be accepted by boys and men. And in doing so, I sort of was conforming to a lot of like misogynist stereotypes and like trying to distance myself from women, and be like, I'm like not like girls, and like girls are like this and this. And I'm just not like that. I'm just different. And it was rooted for me in, misogyny and in like not being aware of where those feelings were coming from, of distance, and pushing away those sorts of characteristics. And tied to that is, I think, an experience in which, for me, medical transition has been an important part of my process of claiming my identity, and taking hormones has made me feel so much more comfortable in my body. It's like, I can't possibly overstate it. And so, so like even after I figured out I was trans and sort of changed my name, changed my pronouns, and was sort of taking up a trans space, I was overcompensating for how uncomfortable I felt in my body by like expressing a gender that was very, very like masculine and butch. It's not really true to my actual gender. And I didn't know that at the time, but I think that's a pretty common experience, is to sort of overcompensate and be so desperate to be seen as your gender that you sort of are trying to fit into what cis people think of as like really masculine. And now that I feel much more comfortable in my body, and I've been like living in my correct identity and my correct gender with my name and pronouns for a few years, I feel a lot more free and comfortable to express a gender that feels really natural and playful. And I don't feel the need to be as strictly like binary conforming to everything masculine all the time, because that's a lot of pressure to put on yourself. I think I don't regret the like differences that my gender expression has taken. I wouldn't say like, be yourself, do exactly what you want no matter what, because I recognize that like passing, quote unquote, or like being seen as your correct gender is really important, and sometimes that necessitates us doing things that don't necessarily feel as natural, and like whatever feels safest and like most comfortable for you is what you should be doing. And also, like your gender's allowed to change. It doesn't make it like less real if it isn't always the same as it is right now. Like you don't need to know exactly what you want to do immediately. Experimentation and play is what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for like a new set of static, unchanging genders. We're fighting to be able to like change our genders whenever we want. And I would also say, like, specifically to like young trans masculine and like trans male FTM, however you identify folks, that misogyny is not cute. And it does not need to be a part of your gender. You can love women and girls and think that women and girls are the greatest people ever. And also like have your own gender that's not that. And you should be fighting for particularly your trans femme, trans feminine, and trans women sisters, because they're your siblings too. So I think some advice that I would have for cisgender folks who are striving to be allies to trans folks in their life, or they're living in, I mean, really, if you're cisgender and you're living in the world today, you should recognize that you definitely already know a trans person, and probably more than one, and you will continue to know more and more as time passes. And if you care about justice in the world, then you should care about how you are stepping up to be a better ally to trans folks and gender nonconforming folks. And I think that feels really overwhelming for a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be, because it's not really about you doing. It's sort of about, it's not about like changing the way that you interact with trans people as much as it is about like changing your basic assumptions about how to be polite to people. And I think that knowing someone's pronouns or like guessing someone's pronouns or getting them wrong is like really stressful for a lot of cis people, which is kind of why we're doing this project. And that's because like it's such a small moment, and yet the consequences are really dire. And it feels really, really awful to be mispronounced. And I think cis people know that instinctively, and so sometimes they try to dismiss what it is to like mispronounce someone because they like instinctively know how disrespectful it could feel. And one thing that I like to say to cis people is that everybody has pronouns. I mean, some people like to use their name and not pronouns, but like even that is like a pronoun choice, including you. And one way that you can step up and be an ally is to sort of change the way that you view your own pronouns. So advocating for, if you are in a space where you're pretty sure it's all cis people, which I'm going to say that you probably don't know that for sure, but like you think you're in your workplace or your yoga class or your whatever is like, you think it's all cis people, but like advocating for sharing your pronouns at the beginning of meeting everyone, sharing your pronouns when you meet people. So if you come up to someone, you'd be like, hi, my name is Thomas and I use he, him, his pronouns. When you meet someone, that's like a really respectful way of changing the conversation and educating other cis people without speaking over trans people. You're sharing your truth and your pronouns in a way that makes it more comfortable and makes it more normal, so that if that cis person that you're introducing yourself to encounters a trans person in the future, they're not like totally taken aback by the idea of talking about pronouns. Talking about pronouns should be commonplace. It should be easy, because everybody has pronouns. If people called you the wrong pronouns all the time, you would be pissed off too. I don't know about something I learned, but it definitely, doing this project offers a perspective on allyship that I think is important, because a lot of allyship is complicated. And I think a lot of times we want to believe that it's simpler than it is, because there's sort of like a double bind in allyship where on the one hand, we live in this reality where people who have more privileged are believed more than people who don't have that privilege. So a cis person talking to another cis person and being like, hey, actually, like, respect for trans folks and gender nonconforming folks is really important. And like, this is one way that I've learned. And hey, actually, like, it takes cis people challenging other cis people for them to learn. Trans people are going to be dismissed. We're going to be seen as oversensitive. We're going to be seen as causing trouble, rabble rousing when we say the same things that cis people can say. And that's an unfortunate reality. And on the other hand, it's one of the worst things that cis people can do and that any ally group can do is to try to tell the story of trans people or speak over trans people. And so one thing that this project, I think, offered to me and to other folks is an example of how cis people can use the resources that they have to share the stories of trans people and gender nonconforming people with largely cis audiences, without speaking over us. So this isn't like Brent interviewing people and then Brent going and like filming himself talking to other cis people. But it also, the unfortunate thing is that we have been, like, trans people have been doing projects like this, and we've been doing it for ages, and cis people don't seem to know that our work exists. And they have an easier time seeing it from other cis people because that's where they have the connections. Like, Brent is connected with lots of cis people who are not seeing the work that we're doing. And this is a way of bringing that work to the surface and hopefully leading more cis people to do more research and investigate how they can support our work and our storytelling about our own identities.
Chandler, thanks so much for your time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
The TC Pride Podcast is a production of Podletter Media and Twin Cities Pride. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or on YouTube at tcpridepodcast.org.